Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about how your camera makes the magic happen. How does it get the perfect amount of exposure? That's what this lesson's all about. So let's dive in. Image sensors. Well, they're much like your eyes. When you go to the doctor's and he checks your eyes, he shines a light in your eye and all you see is white. And then on the other side of that spectrum is at nighttime, you go to bed, you turn your lights out, and the room is pitch black. You don't see anything. The longer you're in that blackness, the more your eyes adapt, though. So you can start to see things you couldn't see originally. What's happening is your pupil is going from this to a much bigger circle, so you can see more. Image sensors, if it's overexposed, the image is too bright because there's too much light. The light colors are blown out, it's just overexposed. Underexposed is because there isn't enough light or bad settings are used and the image becomes too dark. This is an example of your eye, obviously, and this is what your image processor looks like. Choosing the correct amount of exposure is by far the most important thing that your camera can do, and the most important thing that you can do as a photographer. Now, there's something called a stop. What is it? It's a measure of light. When light is doubled or cut in half, the light has changed by one stop. Okay, doubling or cutting in half, going from one setting to the next is doubling or cutting it in half, and it's called a stop. From one aperture to the next is a stop. Okay, so exposure control mechanisms. The first one is shutter. What is it? It's a door that opens and closes quickly to allow light to hit the sensor. Think of it as your eyelid. When you're looking at something, your eyes can be closed. You open up your eyelids, and now you can see something, and you blink, you're done making that exposure. Your eyelids are like the shutter. Shutter speed is how long that shutter stays open. Faster shutter speeds, obviously, because it's open for so much longer, is going to let more light into the camera. On the other hand, slower shutter speeds will allow less. With point and shoot cameras, there isn't actually a door. In your smartphone, there's not actually a door. What just happens is the sensor turns on and then turns off. That's what acts as the shutter speed, the power. A shutter sound, recorded shutter sound, or a beep will let you know the shutter is opening and closing. And this is typically going to be fractions of a second. 1/60th would be the lowest we'd want to go without getting any blur to it. Actually, that's our magic number. 1/60th is typically where we're going to start to see a little bit of soft edges in a photo. But it's typically fractions of a second. Continuing on here with shutter, there we go. If it dips below 1/60th, you're going to end up with something like this. Is this a bad picture? No. But if you look at the edges of the horse's legs, they're soft. Why? Because the shutter speed wasn't quick enough to freeze that motion. Sometimes you'll see shutter will be displayed as just simply 100 instead of 1/100th. And if it says 0 and then a number, it means 0 minutes, 3 seconds. You might be wondering why you would want something so long. Well, especially if you want to get into night photography, that's where you're going to need a lot of time because there's not a lot of light out there to take those pictures. Our next control is aperture. This is what it looks like inside the camera. Okay, it just opens up, and these are, if you look at the front of a lens ring, you'll see numbers on it. It's telling you what your apertures are. What is an aperture? It's the opening of the lens that controls how much light passes through the lens. It's just like a mechanical iris, just like your eye can do. Bigger opening when in dark. Remember, I said about how at nighttime your eye opens up so that you can let more light in and see more in the darkness. Originally, your eyes, your pupil's about like this, but as time goes, it starts to open up so you can see better in the dark because more light can get in then. Small opening when in bright. So if you're in a dark room, or if you're sleeping and your parents come in and they flick the lights on in the middle of the night, your eye was something like this while you're sleeping. They turn the lights on and all of a sudden it's just too much light. What's happening is you're getting too much light into your eyes, so slowly, well, or as quick as it can, your eye is going to start to do something, narrow down like that. The wider the opening, the more light gets through. Stands to reason, right? So this is what your eye would look like in a dark room at nighttime. This is what it looks like typically. So larger aperture, smaller aperture. And looking into the lens here, you can actually see the aperture. Here it's really wide open, a really big one. It's measured in something called f-stops. f8, f11, f16, etc. Less is more. Stopping down the lens is choosing a smaller aperture, which is actually a larger number. It doesn't make a lot of sense that way, but that's how it works. That's what I mean by less is more. Opening up the lens, if you ever hear photographers say something like that, that means they're choosing a larger aperture, which is a smaller number. Apertures available depend on the lens being used. Every focal length, whether you're using a typical 55 millimeter, 200 millimeter, 300 millimeter, it's going to have a different set of apertures because it all comes from an algorithm based off of that length. And the final control mechanism is ISO. What is this? It's a measure of the film's speed or sensitivity. Now, obviously, we don't have film in a digital camera, but we still have ISO. How can we have such a thing? Well, it's caused by increasing the voltage to the sensor. Think of it like this. When you maybe didn't get a lot of sleep last night, so you decide to stop at Rutter's and get a Monster or a Red Bull or maybe just a coffee to give you a little bit of a boost for the day. Well, okay, when you have that added caffeine, maybe you have a couple Red Bulls, how do you feel? Very energetic, very jittery. You know, maybe you're kind of bouncy or overly energetic. The same thing happens to your camera. When we increase the voltage, the sensor gets noisier, it gets jitterier. This is based off of film. Back in the day, when shooting action shots, a photographer would use a high ISO when they were shooting action so that it could stop the action. This would help stop the action without a blur. Pictures would have more grain because it would have bigger grains of light-sensitive material on the film. When shooting scenery, photographer would choose a low ISO because the film has a little less sensitivity, requiring more time to expose, but scenery is not going to, I mean, that tree is not going to move, right? So you don't have to be really quick taking the picture. Pictures would be clearer with less noise, but you don't have to worry about speed, so you can afford to do that. You always want to use the lowest number possible to avoid getting that digital noise. Okay, so 100 ISO, 800 ISO. Look at the grain that's in the two different pictures. Okay? Maybe you don't mind that graininess. Maybe you do, but that's what's going to happen with ISO. Why there are different ways to control light? Well, there's two main ones, aperture and shutter. And using one is just fine for getting the correct amount of brightness, but light is a tricky, tricky thing. So, I'm going to pause this video here, and in the next video, I will get into how all of these combine and work.